Alrighty, hombre.
Check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2.
You got your water and everything.
Got my water. You got your water.
Waveform looks fine. Let's look at my stomach.
Stomach getting just out, as my dad would say. Yeah, it looks good.
Should purchase my...
There we go. Big man steps. There we go.
Made it.
Boom.
Alrighty, buddy.
All right.
I'm gonna put my keys down gently on the table. Ooh.
And today it is February 16th.
February 16th.
And 6:35 p.m.
6:35 p.m. Good to see you, buddy.
Good to see you too.
So we're hoping to do a slightly shorter one this time.
Yeah.
And this is one we've been meaning to do for a while because it's sort of it should open up some topics for us further.
Yeah, exactly.
That is, we're going to talk about allyship.
Yeah.
But in a very specific sort of context. We're going to talk about sort of why we think that we, two very, very white bread males, there you go, represent, should be able to, well, should is a loaded word, but why we think we can talk about race, and maybe also why we think we should be able to talk about race.
Yeah.
And we will hash out the full parameters of that question as we go forward.
Yeah.
But we're going to start, I think, with allyship, and then we'll launch off into why we think we should be able to talk about race.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what is allyship?
Yeah, so allyship is really interesting. I think when I first heard the term allyship, it was a long time ago, but what came to mind were the sort of alliances that the large European powers made during World War I, and for some reason that was just the Allies, you know, and then of course in World War II. So for me, when I heard that term, and that term wasn't applied in that context. It was a very different context of how people with privilege could ally with people who do not have the same privilege, could help them and their movement succeed from a position of power. Right. That's kind of what became known as an ally. But for me, it sort of drew up connotations of, at first, just the allyship or the alliances of convenience that emerged during the Great World Wars. But that's not really what people are interested in.
And it's interesting because your definition there, which I'll have you repeat in a moment, so you can be ready. That pretty clearly to me applies in the Second World War, but not maybe so much in the First World War.
Exactly.
The First World War, in so many ways, the allyship is determined by sort of the way the allegiances that had already been created fell. Whereas in your definition, which was...
So for allyship today, and what we're talking about, is when people in positions of power or privilege ally or help those who do not have those privileges or do not fall into those positions of power. Yeah,
so maybe it applies to both wars. But to me, certainly in terms of assisting a certain side, assisting people who are in trouble.
Yeah, exactly.
It seems to apply more clearly to the
Second World War, exactly.
So that's an interesting definition. And I guess... The question is, so you have, their allies are people in positions of power,
right,
who help people who aren't.
Yes.
Would you consider us to be in a position of power?
Yes, in some respects.
Right.
Yes. Not in others.
But not in others.
Yes.
So, in some respects, then it makes sense that we would be allies, and in some respects, it makes sense that we wouldn't.
Absolutely, and I think that's where a lot of people, where probably almost the majority of people find themselves in some way or another, allies to some groups, and then also directly impacted by in need of allyship in other categories.
So, how do you think we're in need of allyship?
So, I think for us is like we both don't have a lot of money.
Yep.
So we can't really leverage our economics right now to help anybody, to be totally fair. So I think we're needing kind of allyship in that regard. All people of us, because we're all part of the same class roughly as, the majority of us are, like the work, whatever you want to call this, but people who are making under 25,000, I think is the particular class bracket that we're in.
Well below the poverty line.
Which is well below the poverty line, exactly.
Canada.
Exactly. So I think, in that way we and everyone else in that position and people in general need kind of allyship from people in positions of power to sort of undo the damage of that. But I think where we kind of we can be allies is in reference to, race and whiteness.
So before we get onto that, I'm
Yes.
curious what you think people with wealth can do in order to ally with people like us.
Absolutely, that's a big one. That's a really good question. I think in particular, it's a big topic, but one of the things I think they can do is kind of support a political infrastructure that picks specific policies that are designed to benefit everybody.
Right.
Yeah, so things like basic income, for example.
Which you think is valuable. Which has come up before. We probably got to do
one. We've got to do one on basic income, yeah.
So what, do you think that's a similar sort of thing that we can do in order to ally with people on the topic of race?
I think in some ways, yes. And if I can just color like where the differences is, one of the things we can do is have conversations with people, generally like white people, and have conversations with them that people who are non-white might not be able to have.
For sure.
Yeah.
What are we talking about, and what are we saying in this
So
conversation?
I think in some of those, my view of kind of a lot of words like white privilege get thrown around, and I do believe that's a very important topic. White supremacy gets thrown around a lot, but one of the big things I look at is looking at whiteness itself, starting at the root. Like, where did this concept of whiteness come from? Out of that comes white supremacy. Out of that comes white privilege. But I think for me, the starting place, if I'm engaging somebody who doesn't really know or think about that, I start, let's talk about where ideas about whiteness come from. Like, where did we learn this stuff?
So if you can engage with the idea of race,
yes,
and with whiteness, with white people,
exactly,
then you kind of see an opening where you might be able to head people off from heading into these more extremist areas.
Totally, because I think when people hear things like white privilege or even white supremacy, especially if they don't feel
privileged or supreme,
they just kind of shut it down, and they're not able to sort of hear the valid points that person is saying. But if you engage people with whiteness, I found is more successful because, what's whiteness? Wait, I've just heard white supremacy. I've heard always something attached to whiteness. I haven't really engaged with the idea of whiteness itself before. But if you can back
down to sort of the base of the conversation.
Exactly, yeah. So that's kind of my approach to it.
For sure.
That's
sorry.
That's okay. Gabe's just doing his laundry. It's all good.
Yeah, I meant to reset that one.
Oh man! But so, how do you kind of see the ways in which you kind of do you see yourself as able to be an ally to people who are non-white, or is that a fair kind of description of where you're at?
Yeah, I find the topic of allyship very interesting.
Yeah.
Because I think in so many ways, people are tied together.
Yes.
And I think you put forward a very sort of convincing presentation of what it can mean to be an ally and the things that you can do if you don't have wealth.
Right.
Help fund people in particular causes. To me, the place where allyship gets curious is exactly on that dividing line between being somebody who can help and somebody who can't help.
Yeah.
And the question being sort of, what can I as a white man do in order to try and undermine white privilege?
Yes.
And also when you, as you said, when you are in positions where you're not fantastically wealthy, where you're trying to get ahead in the world and make enough money to eat, sleep in warm places, when you're in that position, it's hard to not claim any sort of advantage that you might have.
Right.
So it kind of, one of the things that I think is a challenge about the idea of allyship is the question of how you can put aside your own whiteness.
Yeah.
Is it hypocritical to be trying to interact with this concept while also sort of benefiting from pre-existing structures.
Right.
Because I think the thing that your explanation was maybe missing a tiny bit was sort of an exploration of the ways in which whiteness is structurally set up to advantage people.
Absolutely.
And the fact that we have definitely, I think if we look at our own lives, we've definitely benefited from that.
Absolutely. In a lot of different ways. And I think, I think that's a very valid point because... So sorry, just to wrap up. Yeah, wrap up your point. Yeah, absolutely.
That's why allyship to me is such a challenge, is such a question mark.
Yeah.
Because, that there are ways, as you said, that I think we could see ourselves as allies, as helping people out, as being able to do some small things.
Definitely.
But does that if there are things that we should give up, should we be in a position where we have to give them up, even though we are, as you said, earning less than $25,000 a year? The thing that is a challenge to me with allyship is just this range of complexity, and the way it interacts with these systematic issues.
Absolutely, and I think that's very fair. To maybe give an answer to that question is sort of a bit of a shift in perspective because we're in the time of Lent now, which for Catholics is always about giving stuff up, and for me, I never kind of like to view. Just bear with me, just walk with me as I talk about this. But I never like to kind of think of it as just giving something up. I like to think about it as doing something more. And for me, allyship doesn't necessarily need to mean giving something up or giving power up, especially when you don't really have that much socioeconomic power. It's not fair to ask you to give thousands of dollars away when you make less than $25,000 a year or whatever it is. But I think supporting policies and supporting organizations that you think not only you would benefit from, but also other people struggling would benefit from is really important because racial and economic issues are really heavily tied together, and there's been a lot of work done on showing how policies that we both like a basic income or anything like that, would serve to benefit people who are racialized as well as people who are economically disadvantaged. So for me, it's kind of, that's one of the ways I can functionally get around that issue.
Right.
Is be like, I can help myself out, but I can also help other people out.
And I see that. So I guess in the context of somebody, and this clearly doesn't happen really.
Right.
Or I've never heard of it happening in real life. But if somebody were to challenge you.
Yeah.
And be like, how are you an ally?
Yeah.
What have you done?
Right.
How do you respond to that?
That's a good question, absolutely. And this was the big kind of question when I was going to school. I don't know if you got any of this, but the big thing was...
Not really, no.
Because it was particular at certain kind of liberal arts discourses, especially strong in the U.S., but also here too. I just remember, but they had that saying, for example, that your allyship card expires after every day, which I thought was fascinating. So basically... Funny sort of phrase, but the whole idea boiled down to the fact is that you don't get to call yourself an ally. Other people who you're helping get to call you the ally,
Right.
It's not a badge that you wear kind of thing. It's just sort of like a label that's given to you when you show up enough and help out.
This is very interesting. It leads into my next question, which is how much do you have to do to be called an ally?
Totally. Absolutely.
Who's... This is the other aspect of things that are interesting to me. It's who's making that shot? Who's making the call?
Exactly. Is there a board, allyship board that you kind of come up to every couple months or so, and they review? Well, you showed up at this rally and this protest, but you didn't come to these events. Okay, we're gonna have to put your case aside.
Plus 10 points.
Plus 10, minus 30. Come back in a couple months. We'll see where you're at. Then no, exactly. There isn't, right?
Totally.
There totally isn't. And that's why I think for me, it's never sort of what I sort of like about allyship is it's not a term that I think about when I do stuff that would be considered allyship, because of this exact question. It's like, where does an allyship begin and a end, and who gets to determine that? It's a really thorny and important point. Thank you for making that. But one of the things I think about is friendship.
Right.
And this comes from a more, model working with indigenous peoples, in particular First Nations peoples. They talk a lot about kinship and friendship. So, you don't just show up and ask, the folks at Wewasaka down, which we'll talk about, but down the village, the landback village that's been established out in the East End, you kind of just show up and ask if you can help, if you can do the work. And there's always work to do, and just kind of show up and build a relationship with somebody. And the key, to extrapolate, good relationships are the foundation of this kind of big amorphous concept of allyship. Like, because a good relationship is much easier to, evaluate, in my opinion, than a large sort of idea of allyship, because it's a friendship. And that might be, not the most easily defined things, but there are definitely certain ideas that come to mind in certain categories that we think about when we think about friendship,
You can often know when you're a friend when you might not know if you're an ally.
Exactly. So that makes it a little easier for me. But not everybody has that idea of allyship.
Exactly. That was obviously sort of where I was going to go next.
Yeah.
I think that's a very pertinent idea to the way you interact with the world.
Definitely.
And, the way you go about sort of engaging socially in a general sort of way.
Absolutely.
But for me, who has considerably less of sort of social engagement and just kind of, does less to meet people and is less... I put myself out considerably less, and a lot of my life is very inward focused and focused on me and what I'm doing.
Totally.
That ends up not helping me sort of find myself as an ally.
Yeah.
And it brings back these sort of questions of, how much you have to do and what's systematic and what's not.
Absolutely.
So I think the place where I'm kind of trying to go with all this is, it's in a way I think it should be okay to end up in your sort of position where you're sort of actively working on defining relationships and trying to improve the world in your own way, and not worrying too much about whether or not you end up labeled as an ally.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of a tricky place to be as well, because then you risk not helping people and not doing anything that makes you worthy of being an ally. But the all the baggage that I think we've talked about with allyship kind of puts me in a position where, I actively try and think about things and try and do things that I hope will be able to help people.
Right.
But in so many ways, I don't have any sort of receipt for that.
No, absolutely.
I don't have the ability to say, well, I know these people, or I've done these things that you can see in a march, or that I can demonstrate by social relationships.
For sure.
So much of what I do on every level is about thinking and engaging with the world and writing and trying to put pieces together.
Definitely.
And, in really, that's why I think it's worthwhile that we talk about race.
Yeah.
Because hopefully I can get back from you some of what you've had in your work with people in these communities.
Absolutely.
And if I'm thinking things that are valuable to you, that you can then bring back to them, then that creates like a stream through which some way, somehow, I'm doing something that is somewhat worthy of allyship.
Absolutely.
Even if I'm not directly engaged with the concept.
No, and totally. And I think, it's one of the things we've talked about a lot is something that you're concerned about, is helping people communicate more effectively, and helping people think more effectively about these large, big concepts, many of which we've covered in our podcast so far. Yeah. So I think in that way, you doing something like this, and, you came to me and we're like, let's do a podcast together. Let's just get some stuff out there, when you sat down with me and did our earlier podcast, our Rise podcast, you're like, I'm going to put my skills in the use, and I'm going to lend my time to interviewing someone like Josephine or Floyd or Ion. Exactly.
Admittedly, that was mostly you.
But no, you helped me set it up and helped me go through it and edit the whole thing. Yeah. Exactly. So that I see as like allyship in action, right? You kind of, you might not be, certain skills you might not be showcasing there that are maybe more public, but you're still behind the scenes. In this case, you're front and center and doing the editing stuff. So that's all for me. Another big part of allyship is just how to kind of sort of perform tasks that are essential that might not don't always get recognized. Just kind of the invisible labor that goes behind the scenes, and just kind of showing up for some of that is really, really important.
Totally.
So I think that's some way, but I think getting ideas out there and working on getting ideas out there that you think can help people is a really, I think, important venue of allyship.
Totally.
And one of the big things is not everybody is going to be able to contribute in the exact same way.
Yes,
in the community.
I think that's a really important idea.
That's an important idea. And
that's part of the reason we're struggling so much with this idea of allyship and what it actually means.
Exactly. And that's why, thinking of it more like a relationship for me is helpful in that way, because you have so many different kinds of relationships, and you have relationships that are physical, you have relationships that are close, you have relationships with people on the other side of the globe through, the different ways you interact with online, and all of those are important, Mm-hmm. And even though you might not say, and you still engage with like people online and ideas online, and talk to your friend, even talk to your friends. You talk to me, you talk to your friends online. I know
definitely talk to other people. A lot of my conversations are sort of about ideas and influencing ideas.
Exactly, and bouncing them off each other, and you're also communicating with people online. If people ask questions about economics, something a fair bit about, you walk me through how you respond to them. So that's all part of that, right?
I've been laying off that lately, but
I don't blame you, man. It can be a little rough,
but no, it's an interesting question for me.
Yeah.
I think we've kind of worked up a framework now to address the other part of this, which is why I feel like we can talk about race, and
Absolutely.
I think we should talk about race.
Absolutely.
Because there are so many different pathways in which our interactions and our thinking can reach out and affect these different parts of the world that we may not have direct contact with.
Totally, yeah.
And at a certain point, like, there may be a standard by which people can determine better whether or not you are an ally.
Absolutely.
And if that standard is to emerge, it has to be communicated and spread and talked about. And it's going to be a standard rooted in conversations about race.
Definitely.
So that for me is why it's important that we can sit down and chat about race.
Absolutely.
And, share ideas, and I can bring to you ideas about things that I've read,
totally,
or things that I'm thinking or writing about.
Absolutely.
And you can bring to me ideas about things that you've read and things that you're talking about.
Definitely.
And things that you're engaging with other people.
Definitely. Well. And just having these kind of moments where we come together and collab, like, is something I keep wanting to do, throughout the future. Even if it's less frequent than we're doing now, that's still okay,
I mean, race is a really challenging one, because I do... I can see how that there's always a push for these sorts of social issues where it's like, you could be doing more.
Yeah.
You could be doing more.
Absolutely.
And that's true, but you also can't do everything.
No.
And you can only spend your life doing the things that you are doing.
Yep.
And I feel like spending a lot of your time justifying what you're doing to other people is probably a waste of time.
And is exhausting.
So do you have a response?
Absolutely. I think that's a very key point. And I think, a lot of activists, to myself a certain degree, but I've seen it more so in people who graduated from school, went into a social justice nonprofit or into full-time activism, they experience, burnout. burnout, and part of that is
just too much.
It's just too much, and they put a lot of pressure on themselves and the culture. I won't blame anybody individually because we all participate in it one way or another, but the culture puts a lot of pressure on people to constantly be doing more, to constantly be proving and justifying their allyship, which is really fascinating for me because these are very sort of neoliberal ideas about justifying your labor.
Totally.
You know, also about kind of never doing enough, having to prove your worth to other people, having to show standards of that, I don't think is extremely helpful, you know? And then having this amorphous kind of culture sort of determine, you know, where you fall in the rankings. It's really actually disgusting, you know, frankly, because I think that's not the basis that forms meaningful, transformative relationships that we need to help the people we love who are oppressed in ways we're not, you know. For me, like love is the foundation of that, you know. Love, like, you know, it takes love to go and help people and do things you don't want to do. It takes love to show up and put yourself in uncomfortable situations for the benefit of somebody else, you know. Right. And love is going to get you their guilt or pressure or just, you know, some kind of outside standard that you're working for, in my opinion, is not sustainably going to get you into those transformative roles, you know? Yeah.
You know, I think the response to those sort of people have to this is obviously that we're just trying to get everybody out there to do the stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, maybe you have a response to that. I don't know. This stuff is challenging, and again, I think there are issues. You know, I do like thinking in so many ways.
Yeah.
Interacting with ideas is very much the sort of thing that I work really hard on.
It's really important. Yeah.
And I get a flag for ideas that use a lot of time and don't do anything. It's hard.
Definitely.
You know, there are points where you have to look at the people around you. And you have to make decisions.
Absolutely.
And you have to incorporate their ideas. And you have to choose who's in your life and who's
Yeah.
not in your life. And these are all fascinating and difficult questions for people. But they can be done almost on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
You know, in so many of your interactions with other people, you know, your ability to do things.
Yeah.
If you are doing more,
Yes.
then you need positive influences in your life. You need people who are supporting you and who you can support as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And to a certain extent, you know, some sort of external checklist
Yeah.
is just going to miss the intricacies of your relationships.
Totally. I think
sorry, I'm going to throw this in for half a second. I keep glancing over there because it seems to be cutting out on a fairly frequent basis.
Geez.
So hopefully this is all okay.
This is okay.
But in case you're wondering why I'm staring at the computer screen so much, that's what's going on. I'm following your conversation.
No problem.
It's freaking me out.
Oh yeah, I think that's a really important point. I like that ideas that seem to get a lot of people not doing anything, right? That was really good. I like that a lot because there's a lot of those running around, you know.
Yeah. Totally.
Totally. And for me, it's, you know, this is what I kind of, you know, really took away, this importance of, you know, doing the work and feeling good about it. You know, you in all our lives we have to deal with people we don't like.
Right.
We respect them. You know, we can still respect them without liking them, you know. But ultimately, you want to be spending the most amount of the majority of your time with people you do like and do appreciate and do want to help, you know. And that's really important. And the second is, I think, you know, there's been one of the problems is I see as some of the ideas that roll around that get a lot of people interested, but they don't really lead anywhere, is this idea of like breaking down the system or changing the system. And it's this big amorphous idea of the system. And people just throw the system out there.
Fuck the system.
Exactly, as if it's all bad, and without really understanding what that is, you know? And then I saw a lot of this was like people would show up for rallies at school that would be like F the system in one way or another, but they wouldn't come and distribute food to poor people in the town. You know, they wouldn't come because that was part of the system, right? because it wasn't transforming the entire system. It wasn't worthy of their time to do.
If it's not the revolution, then why show up? Right?
Exactly. I mean, but for me, what's more revolutionary than helping people stay alive? You know?
Exactly.
That's the difference between life or death, or something. Literally, sometimes for people, you know. And if that's not worth it in and of itself, if that's not allyship, I don't know what is, you know. You know what I mean? Yeah. So, you know, in the same way as if you having a conversation with somebody or getting an idea out there, and you know, in ways that you might not even know are having an impact, but say, because you say a lot of really cool stuff and have a really cool perspective, you get that out there, you could be changing countless lives. You know, you might just not know about it.
Yeah.
Or you might find out like 5 years later. Totally. And stuff like that.
I think this is a good part. Yeah. Of why we're doing this podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, we're doing it so that we can look back and so we can put ideas down on tape and refer to them and have discussions that exist in more than just our own brains.
Totally.
Because even, you know, I've done nothing to try and get this podcast out, basically.
Yeah.
Other than actually produce it and put it on the internet.
Exactly.
But that's because I'm relying on the fact that A, it's mostly for us.
Yeah.
And B, they're big chunks.
Yeah.
They're almost an hour of us talking a lot of the time. You know, people are going to have to be engaged.
Right.
You know, it doesn't make sense for me to work really hard to draw people to videos that they have to be invested in to even bother watching.
Right. Exactly.
So this idea of, you know, how we bring information to people, and just doing things,
definitely,
you know, spending your time, you know, it doesn't have to be making a podcast or even directly communicating with people, but spending your time doing things that make the world a better place.
Absolutely, man.
You know, there's allyship with it's why this idea of allyship, you know, I keep coming back to it. You know, people need to be allied with people who are disadvantaged.
Definitely.
But they also just need to be allied with people.
Yes.
You know, we don't do enough as people to make being a person better.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And that's...
And this is what, you know...
I want people to do.
And it's so true. And, you know, I really kind of think about that in a time like COVID, because our social relationships with each other, and just even the way we treat strangers, are just degrading, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Totally. And where, you know, the homeless people have been struggling for a long time to make ends meet, but now they're struggling even more because people don't even want to approach them right now.
Sure.
You know? And I just think, you know, just remembering that exactly what you said, if you can make someone's life better, either, you know, in a physical way or a way that gets them to think better, that's worth it. You know, that's really worth it. And I also think, like, you know, one thing I want to come back to is, because we talk a lot about skills and skill building and how to get better at things and improve. Like, allyship is a skill, if you want to look at it like that. Relationships building are skills, you know. And
I think there are real opportunities as well for people to experience maybe what it's like to not be super white.
Yeah.
Like, I remember I was like standing on the curb. I was going from book box hunting in the neighborhood, and I was just standing on the curb, and this like lady with two dogs comes down from behind me. Yeah. And I'm like on the edge of the curb, and she's like, "Excuse me," and I'm like miles away from her, but I walk off into the street so that she can walk her dogs around the corner. Right. And at the time, it's just like, you know, she's nuts. Yeah. But as I thought about that later, it seemed like something that would happen if you were racist and the person was of color. Yeah, exactly. You know, that interaction is just one of the many little things that can happen to people in those positions. Absolutely. And it even in that basic little way, like, these things really don't happen to me very often. Right. And this still kind of sucked. Like, it's stuck in my brain. It's like, why didn't you just go around me? Like, you could have walked off the street. Why am I walking off the street for you? Yeah, exactly. So these ways of thinking about race, of incorporating these ideas, of trying to see the world, you know, as somebody else might experience it. Absolutely. I think these are ways that you can even perform allyship without directly acting on people who desire it.
Definitely.
Or sorry, not desire it, but people who require it.
Absolutely. Just putting yourself in someone else's shoes is really, really important.
Yeah, totally.
And it's a lot hard. It's simple. It's one of those things. It's simple, but not easy all the time to do, right?
Totally.
But I think that's really important. Let's see, anything.
I think we've talked about like why we think we can talk about race.
Yes.
I think we've covered a lot about why we should talk about race.
Definitely.
It's been a really good treatment of allyship.
Yeah.
I suppose the last piece of the puzzle is kind of because of what we've talked about, where we've developed it to, and what we've come to. It seems like in many ways the section of your life labeled allyship doesn't have to be very distinct.
Yeah.
They can kind of blend into the other things that you're normally doing and thinking about. And that's a lot of what we've both
talked
done,
about. Mm-hmm.
Is that, in a way, we're not actively trying to go out in the world and do allyship and have a section of our life devoted to that.
Yeah.
We've just sort of managed to sneakily incorporate it into the things that we are already doing.
Yeah.
So the final question I guess I want to end on is sort of, is that enough?
Yeah.
I know you don't have to have an answer.
No, absolutely.
But is that enough?
Is it worth it? I think that's a really good way to think about it. So my opinion on that, just to drop it real quick, is that adapting to a changing world that we live in, and that includes things like we've talked about with climate change and other things going on with the political, state of our affairs, requires us to be in greater community with each other.
Right.
Requires us to do exactly what we've talked about, to help other people out and put ourselves in a position of that. And I think more and more what I'm striving to do and what I think is really valuable is kind of make that my life.
Right.
If that makes sense, where the sort of idea of allyship as distinct from the way I'm living sort of disintegrates, I'm going to try and live by basic actions in the mode that I think is going to help everybody survive properly and adapt properly to those changes. So, in question, is that enough? I think if the values that you kind of tape on allyship are the ones we talked about helping people, about love, about relationship building, about being, just helping other people in various ways, if more and more of that becomes just less of like, this is what I did for 3 hours this morning, more just like, this is how I just want to live my life, and this is what I strive for, then I think it's enough. And then because I think it has to be enough,
Cool.
Yeah.
Because if you're asking people to live their lives for something, what more can you ask?
Yeah, exactly. So totally. What do you think?
No, I think that's a really good answer. I think a huge amount of what I'm doing these days is trying to figure out how to live my life. And how to spend my days. And a lot of that is insular, and a lot of that is self. Sort of focused on the self.
Totally, yeah.
But I am doing all that with the hopes of being able to present ideas and to give people help in ways that actually sort of changes things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that there's always going to be a list of tasks that I could do more of.
Right.
But even in as basic as sort of the amount of organization that I've done,
right.
My practice sort of putting projects together and executing them.
Yeah.
I'm putting myself in a position where in the future, hopefully, I will be able to do a particular thing.
Yeah.
At a particular time that is helping
definitely
a group that requires it.
And you might be like, as you're helping me with this, maybe you can help out as you are, you might have that, some of that might be, I'm going to help other people put projects together. Exactly. Or think about how to put projects together, think about how to take, how to make large insurmountable things seem,
manageable,
navigable. Exactly. Yeah. That's really important.
So I'm really hoping that by doing that, by sort of setting an example of how I want to live my life and trying to stick to it, that on some basic way, that becomes less insular, and other people can copy that and
Definitely.
get to live the lives they want to live.
Definitely.
Which, if you manage to do that, I feel like you manage to help a lot of people and solve a lot of problems.
Absolutely. Definitely, man.
All right, buddy.
All right, this is a good one.
Thank
Boom.
you.
Thank you.
Looking back in the years, what do you want to see that you've done? What do you want to see that you've changed?
Yeah, for sure. So I think in particular, I'd like to kind of do more stuff on talking about allyship and having more conversations with people, smart conversations like the one we're having with people on the topic of allyship and putting them out there. So I think they would help a lot of people. And I'd also like to see who I'm in, what organizations or what kind of people I'm in that kind of relationship with, like friendship working towards something greater than ourselves. So who's in the picture, just more generally.
Exactly.
How about you, man? What do you want to look back at and see?
Looking back, I think I would like to see that especially, that I've finished some of these projects that I'm working on, obviously, but in a bigger picture kind of way, that I have gotten better at connecting with more people and at producing some of these relationships with people of color or not. Yeah. But regardless, that help. Yeah. Sort of destabilize these structures of systematic inequality. Right. Because I think it would sort of defeat the purpose of the whole conversation to just say it would just be me trying to make friends with people of color.
No, I understand. Yeah,
but make friends with people who I can, my ideas can interact with, right? And together we can help make the world a better place for everybody.
Exactly, man.
Because that's I do feel maybe I'm a little too inwardly focused right now, but.
It's also really cold outside,
It's cold outside. Hard to meet people. There's a global pandemic right now.
It's hard to talk to somebody on the street and get to know them right now. Yeah, I must say.
Or stumble into them at a bar or whatever.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
So looking back, it would be nice. That's the piece that I'd like to have added in.
That sounds great, man. Right. Hey, thanks for doing this one, man.
Thank you.
This was a good one.
You too, buddy. Only 42 minutes.
Only 42 minutes. Hey, we did okay.
Yeah, I knew it was cutting out. Bastard.